Hello, welcome to the conversation. My name is Kris Kaim. I'm the chairman for Geostrategic Forecasting Corporation. With me today is Dr. Vassilios Damiras, our chief executive officer. Vassilios, how are you doing today?
Fine, very much, Chris.
All right. The conversation is a podcast program that we are publishing several times a week, which will discuss current events going on around the world. This is our first show, and I will admit that it's not exactly the most professional setup that we have here compared to others that may exist. But it's an effort that we want to do in order to educate and educate people on what's going on around the world, offer a unique perspective on what's happening, and hopefully anyone who listens to this can take away from this enlightening information, or at the very least, better informed about what's going on. Today, what we're going to discuss is the recent presidential elections in the Ukraine, as well as the recent rise in violence that have taken place, particularly on the in the east side of the country. Uh, the lately This past week, the Donetsk People's Republic had declared itself autonomous from the Ukrainian region, and a very pro-Western part of Ukraine. They feel that they are more towards the Russian side than they are the Ukrainian side in this cause. And a lot of the conflict in in Ukraine today stems from this kind of divisive feeling when it comes to ethnicity, whether you're Ukrainian or Russian. And this has resulted in a lot of conflict in the area. Um, with Crimea's recent annexation by Russia, there is concern that other regions in the Ukraine and elsewhere in Eastern Europe may follow suit, especially with a high proportion of ethnic Russians in that area. The so-called Donetsk People's Republic is no exception to this. And this past week, there's been a violent clash, particularly near the Donetsk airport on May 26th, where at least 50 pro-Russian rebels have been killed by the Ukrainian military. Um, Vassilios, I want to get your take on this, but first I kind of want to go back and I want to talk a little bit about what's going on or what happened with the recent Ukrainian presidential election. Uh, Petro Poroshenko was elected with the majority of vote, 54.7% of the vote to be exact. His opponent, Yulia Tymoshenko, who personally I felt was a stronger candidate, may not have been a better candidate, but a stronger candidate given her background, um, apart from her recent prison sentence. Uh, Surprisingly, she came in second with 12.81% of the vote. And Poroshenko, admittedly, I knew very little about prior to the election, and I'm still getting to know to this day. I understand that he is a Ukrainian billionaire. He owns the largest confectionery factory in Ukraine, and he's been a key player within the Orange Revolution about 10 years prior, and kind of involved himself within Ukrainian politics, at least as part of the opposition up to this point. Vasilis, I wanted to get your take on what you thought about the presidential election and where do you see this going forward.
Thank you. I think it's very important, and of course, it's important because, interesting enough, Petro Poroshenko is a businessman, not a politician. And I assume that he wants to create a pro business environment in Ukraine. Of course, the European Union has severe economic problems, and the main powers in the European Union, Germany, France, and Britain, yes, in one hand, they want a more pro-Western Ukraine, but they know that if Ukraine joins the EU, they need to uh, give them money in order to support the Ukrainian economy. The southern part of the European Union has severe economic problems, and they see Ukraine another problem that if again Ukraine joins the EU, they will lose their own financial support from Brussels, and that support will be directed to Kiev. In addition, of course, you have the United States that wants to see pro-Western Ukraine, as far as President Obama has indicated. Of course, again, United States is leading from behind. And obviously, President Putin from Russia doesn't want to see Ukraine leaving his spheres of influence. It's interesting enough that Putin indicates that he wants to de-escalate the crisis and will recognize the president. But obviously, the eastern part of Ukraine has also these natural resources that Russia wants. Russia can blackmail Ukraine with the pipelines that they go through from Russia to Ukraine. And that will be an interesting kind of conversation if that happened between the now Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko and also Putin. The thing that I see that obviously Russia wants to recreate the Cold War. The United States refuses to see that kind of behavior. Many times Secretary of State Kerry says, well, we are in 21st century time and Putin wants to do 18th century diplomacy or aggression, but we need to react. I don't say that we need to go to a warm war, but again, we need to take steps that are more conducive to our allies in the region and obviously NATO.
Now, you mentioned steps. Now, during this whole fiasco, for lack of a better term, there was um, the promotion of sanctions against the Russian government, particularly against certain individuals and companies. Now, there is the threat of a third round of sanctions against Russia, this time covering entire sectors. Since the sanctions have taken place, or really since the whole Ukrainian crisis kind of engulfed itself, the ruble had went down. Now, not long after the sanctions and not long before the recent presidential elections, Vladimir Putin had said that he was going to withdraw Russian troops from the Ukrainian border and basically stand down. This to me, this seems like a unique step. If anything, I had figured that Russia would have taken a more aggressive posture, especially with the Ukrainian government saying that they were going to conduct counter-terrorism operations in the east. What do you think attributed to that with that standing down order, with the eventual withdrawal? And do you think that that is something that Putin intends to stick with, or is it just simply a decoy?
I believe the evidence, the way that I see the evidence, probably is a decoy. I think maybe Putin wants to reevaluate certain targets of his policy towards Ukraine. The thing is also that we see that these separatists, they take money or military support from Russia, even if he has withdrawn major units from the Russian units from the border. That doesn't mean that they will stop funding the separatists.
Do you think, though, that sanctions may have something to do with Russia kind of lowering its rhetoric and its military stance?
Probably because I think some of the oligarchs, they don't want to face the severe sanctions. I don't believe that we have imposed severe sanctions, but obviously if you are a businessman, even if you are a corrupt businessman, the oligarchs, they don't want to face that kind of any kind of sanctions. But I think Putin is determined to gain some territory in Ukraine, or even to recreate the old Soviet Union glory. He's also a former KGB official, and I think that is his main policy. Obviously, I don't know if he has even the money to go 100%, but I mean, he's determined to move that kind of direction.
You mentioned kind of regrouping the old Soviet glory. Just a few days ago, Russia agreed to a new economic order, if you will, between Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. This is probably a consequence of the sanctions that was put on Russia, but also as a counterweight to, say, the European Union. Now, interesting enough, even though that it's Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus that have all agreed to kind of form this economic pact, I believe that the economies of Belarus and Kazakhstan cannot compete with, say, a France of Great Britain, or Germany, or Poland, or a coalition of these countries, and most certainly the United States. If anything, it almost seems symbolic that Russia's defiance in the face of sanctions and increasing American and European attitude against their actions in the East, um, it just seems symbolic, and it almost seems that there's no weight behind it. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. It's symbolic, but because now the EU has a very bad image, sometimes symbolism, even empty symbolism, can create a better picture, can create that Russia is very strong. EU faces a severe political, economic, and social problems. And if the EU doesn't catch their acts together, I don't know how we'll survive. I mean, obviously, some EU leaders, they say that the United States will come with a new Marshall Plan. I don't know even that we have that kind of money. But right now, in any time, diplomacy, symbolism, and politics go together. And that can have also some better effects for Russia to show that it's strong.
Perhaps a Western response to the Ukrainian crisis and Russia's aggressiveness in the East early in this conflict, particularly after what happened in Crimea. One of the suggestions in the appropriate European American response in Ukraine was to have uh, um, the Ukraine admitted in NATO, as well as bringing back the missile defense shields in Poland, uh, and of course working to export natural gas into the Ukraine, which is supplied mostly from Russia. I know a few years ago the Russian gas line pipeline was a top issue in the country, and it's no doubt an issue today. In fact, I believe uh, next month, unless Ukraine keeps up with its payments, the Russians are going to cut them off gas-wise, which of course will bring about a lot of issues in the country. But if we're dealing with symbolic issues, or even not so symbolic issues, um, one of the options was to certainly allow the Ukraine into NATO and allow it under its protection, which would probably allow Russia not to attack directly against the Ukrainian military or civilians or what have you. Um, but we do not know how committed NATO is in protecting the Ukraine. We don't know how committed the European is in protecting the Ukraine, whether it's militarily or whether it's economically. But certainly, it's not something that we should ignore, because the balance of power between Russia and the European Union and the United States is in balance right now, and there's certainly a tug of war that is taking place in the Ukraine, and how the situation in Ukraine plays out determines the course of action Russia may take in the rest of Eastern Europe, particularly in Estonia, Latvia, Poland, other nations of that sort. And um, the lack of response or weak response by the European Union and the United States could be a signal that Russia can go ahead with their actions, because they know that the consequences that they may suffer will be minimum in the long run. What do you think of that?
Yes, I agree. And let's talk a little bit about NATO. When Bush introduced, President Bush, then President Bush, introduced that to the last conference about Ukraine and Georgia, the Europeans wanted to say no to President Bush to indicate that they are independent. And that was the lost opportunity. Here in the United States, you have some thinkers or realist thinkers that they don't want to see Ukraine in NATO. They say that can create severe problems. Right now, the way that the situation is, I don't think so that they will reintroduce the idea that it needs to be part of NATO. It's a hot spot that even if they, let's assume that Ukraine joins NATO, that automatically the way that Russia behaves, you need to deploy troops, NATO troops in Ukraine. The thing NATO can do and has done to some extent is to beef up the security around Ukraine, because the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, so on and so forth, to reintroduce again the missile defense initiative to Poland and Czech Republic and take steps to help Europe and Ukraine to become independent from the Russian energy policy. That also will take time, but that can be some policies. But right now, I don't think so that NATO will be that Ukraine will be the new the new member of NATO.
Now, what do you think President Poroshenko should do in response to in response to Russia and to the growing separatist movement in the east?
Well, he said that he wants to talk with Putin. That's fine, obviously. They have not cut any diplomatic relations. I hope that Putin, because I know Putin is very mean to his visitors many times, I hope that he will respect him. With the separatist movements, I don't think so he can allow Donetsk to break away from Ukraine. There, I think we go to a kind of a small or a civil war or asymmetrical kind of threat. But if that happen, will indicate that he's a weak president to Putin, and Putin can again re-escalate the situation.
Well,
The issue,
the issue
yeah,
that I see, here, and while from an economic, capitalist globalization perspective, his background it would be a benefit, but the fact that Poroshenko is a businessman, um, I feel that is a hindrance in the process of acting as essentially commander in chief to the Ukrainian military, but also as an authoritative figure in the face of his enemies, namely the separatists and Russia. Um, do you think that the fact that Poroshenko is really a businessman, and for that matter, a confectionery businessman? I mean, I love chocolate as much as the next person, but he is he's a chocolate factory owner. He's like the Willy Wonka of the Ukraine. Um, do you think that that would be a negative, a hindrance to his portrayal as a leader?
could be. Again, it's how he will react and how he will understand what is to be a commander in chief. I mean, we need to see, I mean, how he will behave. He has great challenges. Now, sometimes people they say businessman also is like a you need to know about warfare. It's a different kind of warfare, but still it's a warfare when you're a businessman. But time will show, will indicate how he will react. Of course, sometimes you don't have, and especially Ukraine doesn't have too much time, and that will be an interesting factor how he will behave. In addition, he has also his own problems. He has also a very right wing section that needs to also to cartel because the Europeans they don't like this kind of a semi-fascist kind of political parties that they're orbiting in various European capitals. That means not only he has a challenges how to face Putin and the Donetsk separatists, but also has challenges how to cartel or change some of his Ukrainian political factions.
Hmm.
He has severe challenges, and obviously the main thing to face challenges, you need to have money. And here is how obviously everybody looks to the United States if they want to spend that kind of money.
I spoke a couple weeks ago. I spoke with an individual who was in the Ukraine. She's actually a writer for us, and she was in the western part of Ukraine. I forget the town, and she was visiting family. And I spoke with her, and I wanted to get a feel for what the situation was in that country. And she said that it was very tense. She said that when it comes to how do I put this? When it comes to the divide between the Ukrainians and Russians, it's apparent. But the thing is that the further west you go, the further western part of Ukraine that you go, the less tense it is. She said that a lot of the tension is remained in the Kiev area, in the capital Kiev, and east towards the border. I asked her, what did the Ukrainians typically think of when Crimea was annexed by Russia, and she told me that it wasn't much of a loss. Generally, the people there feel that it was too much of an upkeep anyways, and that they weren't really part of the Ukraine, given the fact that the ethnic makeup of it were primarily Russians. So it's not as homogenous uh, as people may think. There is a clear divide, and that if you're Ukrainian, you are Ukrainian. If you are Russian, you are Russian. There is no allegiance, or a mixed allegiance. Allegiance. If you are Russian, you're not going to support the Ukrainians. You're going to support Russia, and that seems to be the the makeup of the ethnic slash social situation that is present in Ukraine. But along with that, I noticed a degree of apathy. When she was telling me this, I felt that the further west you went, the further away from the conflict that you were, um, there seemed to be an increase in the apathetic nature of the people. And I find that concerning, because if that's the case, then it does not seem, in my opinion, to be concrete unity among the Ukrainian people, which I feel could be a hindrance to reestablishing Ukrainian sovereignty over lost territory or conflicted territory. And I think that that would be, in the long run, a very bad thing, and something that Poroshenko may need to address. Obviously, Ukrainian nationalism is much different than any other kind of nationalism. It's different than British nationalism or American nationalism or Russian nationalism. But there is some degree in nationalism present, and I think that for Poroshenko's sake, he needs to exploit that to the best that he can in order to ensure national unity, especially in the face of the separatist movement, especially in the face against the Russian military.
Yes, I agree. And we do, I mean, obviously, Ukraine had a long time of corruption, and people can be apathetic also how to defend a state that is also notorious to be corrupt. I know that if you wanted to be a general in the Ukrainian army or a colonel, you can pay your way and you can get the title. And for this reason, if you remember, after the Cold War, Ukraine had huge amounts of weapons, but they start selling these weapons all over the place. And for this reason, even now, they don't have the kind of material to defend the Ukrainian proper. But the Ukraine, yes, is a very convoluted situation. And it's not an easy answer or an easy solution, because when you have that kind of ethnic cleavages and fissures, it's a serious problem. I mean, even Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations, he had a whole chapter about Ukraine. And he's not alive, but I'm sure if he was alive now, many people would say how true he was in his prediction, how Ukraine can be one of that kind of the clash of civilizations, two different, not different kind of civilization, but in a way, two different people that can split the country apart.
Well, let's transition there to the Donetsk People's Republic, and I apologize if I mispronounce Donetsk, or is it Donetsk, or
Donetsk, I think.
Donetsk. Well,
Yeah.
I apologize in advance if the pronunciation is wrong, but I would like to talk briefly about that situation. In April, that particular region broke away, declared essentially sovereignty from the Ukraine, and essentially pledges its allegiance to Russia. Um, for about a month, the separatist movement had grown in size. A lot of aggression, a lot of government buildings were seized, a lot of violence in the streets. Amateur videos you can find all over the internet of the violence. And the Ukrainian government, prior to the elections, had declared a crackdown on the separatist movement, a counterterrorism operation, which initially was met with mixed success. I would venture to say that in the beginning, a lot of it was just failure. There were reports that Ukrainian military units surrendered, that there was really no fighting. The rebels had taken over military units' supplies and stolen weapons and whatnot. However, consider the sources. A lot of that information was published by Russia Today, which considering they are part of the Russian government, or at least funded by the Russian government. You have to kind of weigh the sources. However, the operation was delayed during the presidential election and would not resume until afterwards. And this was respected, and this was carried out. And immediately after the elections, as soon as Poroshenko was declared the winner, he resumed, the interim government had resumed operations against the separatist rebels. And on May 26th was perhaps the biggest battle that had taken place between the Ukrainian military and the separatist group in Donetsk, called the Battle of Donetsk Airport. Vice magazine, they do fantastic documentaries all over the world, especially in hot zones. They had reporters on the scene at this battle, and for about 2 days they were on the scene there filming footage of this gun battle that was taking place at the airport. Now the situation was the rebels had taken over a terminal at the airport, and the Ukrainian military came in and stopped it. That's the long and short of it. A battle ensued, and the Ukrainian military moved in to fight the rebels with ground troops and air support. It was all captured on footage. The carnage was captured on footage. There was scenes of dead bodies, civilians scattered all over the street. Truckloads of wounded rebel soldiers were moved in. Even some of those trucks were destroyed by the Ukrainian military, we assume. And all around it was just carnage. It is at this time, it is declared that the Ukrainian military had succeeded in retaking the airport and slowly reestablishing control in the region. I do anticipate this to be a very long and drawn out process. No doubt the Russian government is supplying the rebels with armaments, and most certainly the European Union and the United States they're supplying the Ukrainian military with arms as well. This is typical of any proxy war. What concerns me, however, is that while this is going on, Chechen rebels have come in and sided with the rebel group, declared their support for Russia, and supposedly, allegedly, has sent fighters in to assist the rebels fight the Ukrainian military. Now that's a very concerning matter, because we all know that the Chechen war between the Chechen rebels and Russia was very long, was very deadly war, and Chechen rebels have flown across the Middle East into Iraq, into Afghanistan to fight against American and other coalition forces there through very unconventional means, guerrilla warfare, suicide bombing, and those types of forces have a tendency to make a conflict draw out, and it eventually becomes a war of attrition. If it's true that the Chechen rebels are involved in the fighting against the Ukrainian military in support of Russia, then where do you see that going compared to it just being a regular separatist movement?
Oh, can bring other people can be the neo-Nazis from Europe. You can have an attraction, a center of attraction to bring other fighters, even people coming from Syria. I mean, right now, as Dr. Kaplan said, geography plays a role. Something that happens in Ukraine can have regional or even global ramifications. And that can create a protracted, as you said, protracted conflict. And that can be, even if you, let's say, settle some major difference between Ukraine and Russia, the conflict can go on and on and on. That is the situation, that these kinds of lack of power or a dominant power or other kind of challenges or economy that can benefit the people create a kind of vacuum that you have these kinds of asymmetrical conflicts. And it's very easy now to waste these kinds of conflicts due to globalization. People easily can move up and down, and that creates severe problems. And you don't want to have that in Europe, but I see now we can have another situation that was happening in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. That can happen now in Ukraine, and that can be more severely due to, again, the different global opportunities for these kinds of conflicts. And not only you have these kinds of non-state actors, but eventually you draw countries that they support these non-state actors. And that can create severe problems that we don't need to have. But time will show, and also the determination of the United States and also Russia, how long they want to see. I mean, what will be the end of these kinds of conflict? Because if we have, as we said about proxy wars can go for a long time. El Salvador, Nicaragua, during the Cold War we had these kinds of proxy wars. Vietnam, that even it was a direct war for the United States, but it was a proxy war for Russia, mainly Russia. China didn't like North Vietnam.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. At this point, it's a wait and see moment, and I think that
Yes.
I am very interested in seeing how this plays out. And no doubt, there is going to be more, for better or worse. So no doubt, I'd like to revisit this issue at a later time, but for right now, again, it's just a wait and see. I think that's going to conclude today's program. Folks, I appreciate you listening. Again, this is our first show, and I do intend to making more. My name is Kris Kaim. I'm the chairman for Geostrategic Forecasting Corporation, and with me is Dr. Vassilios Damiras, our chief executive officer. And we have just discussed the recent presidential elections in the Ukraine, as well as the separatist movement in the Donetsk People's Republic and the battles that have ensued. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I wish you all a very wonderful day. Thank you very much.